Welcome to Cultivated Live for Wednesday, May 1st. And what a May 1st it's going to be. I'm Jay Rosenthal, the co-founder of Cultivated Media, the host of Cultivated Live. I'm here with my co-founder and Cultivator's editor-in-chief, Jeremy Berke. Jeremy, welcome.
Thank you, Jay. It's a huge day. I love it.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's a big day. We got a lot of people backstage, which nobody who's watching can see, but it's going to be a busy one. I guess what's going on, Jeremy?
A little thing called rescheduling, which, for cannabis nerds like ourselves, it sounds small, but it is a huge deal. And I am really excited. And I'm really excited for today's show to get into what it all means.
I am too. And we're going to have, I'll run down a section of what we have, but just a quick note for those behind the scenes. Yesterday, I was getting on a flight at about 2:15, and I think it was like 2:10 or something. I saw the news and I texted Jeremy. He was on his way home. He's finishing up finals. And it's like, it always happens at the worst time. So it was a mad rush to get folks to join us today because we wanted to get first reactions from folks, what their perspectives were on rescheduling, of course, but also what they expect for the future. So we put together a special Cultivated Live. We're obviously streaming on our YouTube channel. We're streaming on our LinkedIn channel. So welcome, everybody. Nice to have you here. Thank you for being here. You ready to hear what we have coming up, Jer?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. So in a minute, we're going to get to a quasi-panel discussion, setting the stage for what rescheduling means from a legal and financial perspective with Brian Vicente from Vicente LLP, a leading U.S. cannabis law firm, Sundie Seefried, the CEO and president of Safe Harbor Financial, a leader in facilitating financial services and credit facilities to the regulated cannabis industry, and Morgan Paxhia, the co-founder and managing director of Poseidon, a leading cannabis investment fund. Jared, these are folks that we look to all the time for insight, not always at the same time, but I'm really jazzed about that.
Yeah, look, we wanted to have people smarter than yourself and me kind of explain what this all means for the cannabis industry. And just to underscore how momentous this day is, right? This is what we've been reporting on. This is what we've been waiting for. It seems incremental. It's really not. It's the biggest change in federal drug policy in half a century. So let's get into it.
Yeah, we'll get into it. And then after this conversation, we're going to go into a conversation with we're calling operators' perspectives with two CEOs, Brandon Pollock, the co-founder and CEO of Theory Wellness, and David Goubert, the president and CEO of Air Wellness. If all goes well, they'll be joining us backstage, and then I'll bring them on stage. But let's get to Brian, Sundie, and Morgan. Give me 1 sec to do a little fancy stuff backstage. There we go. I did it. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to ask that folks unmute themselves. I did it. We're okay. Welcome, everybody. We are excited to have you. If we could, Brian, you just joined us. Thank you for being here. And just to note, I think everybody is at least 2 hours behind the East Coast from what I can tell from everybody's.
Sorry.
The numbers of cups of coffee are certainly adding up. But Brian, can we start with you, as you've been practicing in the cannabis space, I guess before there was really even a cannabis space, but as a lawyer and talking to normal people, Jeremy and I, what does rescheduling mean? What does it mean, I guess, for the industry, for you, for what you're talking to clients right now?
Sure, Jay. I mean, it's just massive. This is the biggest thing to happen at the federal level for cannabis in 50 years. And, cannabis since 1971 has sat right next to heroin as a Schedule I controlled substance, right? So it's just sort of, it's an acknowledgement by the federal government that there's medical value, which of course all your listeners know and the majority of Americans know. But to have the federal government make that acknowledgement is a giant deal. It sets this process into motion for, essentially a comment period for probably the next 60 or 90 days. And myself, and I'm sure many others, will be sending in comments about why marijuana is legitimate medicine. It should be Schedule III or perhaps beyond someday. And then the DEA will make their ruling, and we really think they'll probably do the right thing. But, so from a movement perspective, it's enormous. And I think it's really going to impact, legislators, voters, people who are thinking about this issue that I guess have been taught it's as dangerous as heroin, but now the feds are backing away from that. So giant issue for many of our clients and cannabis business owners, but it's just also a giant issue for the movement.
Yeah. Sundie, if I could go to you next, also in the same time zone as Brian, and 3 cups in. As someone that lends in cannabis, which is a notoriously challenging slice of the sector, maybe one of the most challenging, how does it impact, I guess, benefit, change, how Safe Harbor Financial will do its work, if you've even sort of got that far in your sort of 24 hours of hearing the news?
Like, I think this is, like, again, a great day for the cannabis industry. And I think, like everybody else, we've been preparing for this. I think that I've said several times in the last year, I think rescheduling is going to happen before safer banking after 10 years of trying to get that done. So I think it's a much better move for the industry. As far as changing the banking environment, I think it's only going to be better. What we've seen in the last 10 years is that, you know, they're so cash tight because of the taxation issue and the inability to take all those deductions, that where 94, 95, 96% of the funds that come into the accounts go out of the accounts simply because, you know, they have to pay so much in taxes. I think this is going to be the best thing. It's going to qualify more people for lending opportunities. It's going to, I think, attract more capital, and I'm sure Morgan can speak to that. I think it's going to attract more capital, which then increases deposits and the ability to expand the market. So we're really excited about what it's going to do, but it's only going to open up more opportunities for safe harbor, I believe.
That's good.
Yeah, we're excited.
Good for you, but also good for the industry for sure. Jerry, you have something from Morgan?
Yes. So sorry, my computer was freezing a little bit there. Morgan, you and I have talked a lot about the industry. I think since the first story I wrote talking to you was 2016. And so we've obviously come a long way. We've seen a lot of business cycles since then. How will this kind of change the specific parts of the sector that we might be overlooking right now? Like, is there one part of the sector in the cannabis industry that's going to see a bigger impact from rescheduling than others?
Well, what I really think is impactful about rescheduling is the change in cash flow dynamics, and the implications benefit everybody from the small operators to the largest operators, specifically plant touching companies, because now we have visibility to no longer being under the stranglehold of 280E that was absolutely destroying the cash flow generation of these companies and putting a lot of small businesses out of business, or not even having a real shot at building a business because the tax code was just so onerous. It's profound, this rescheduling. It's a big step. Obviously, we do need continued progress. We need banking reform. There's more plumbing work to be done, but having the federal government, as Brian was saying, it's incredible for the first time in 50 years to recognize that this is not the most deadly substance on the planet, right? It was just completely insane. But we were just talking with Boris yesterday from Curaleaf on our Higher Exchanges podcast. And he reminded us how much they will see in 280E savings this year alone is $175 million. So when you talk about the impact on these businesses, it's absolutely significant to have that kind of cash dropping to the bottom line. For some, this means that their balance sheets have a path to being shored up. For some, this means an acceleration of growth. The whole ecosystem can light up just with its own cash generation capability. But it will also bring in new sources of capital that have largely been on the sidelines waiting for the acknowledgement from the federal government that this is a viable industry to invest in. So we see this as a big first step, but it is a first step. We know it's going to be volatile through this process. But first and foremost, having a fundamental industry that is investable is something we haven't seen in years. The last time I think the door was really meaningfully open was back in the Trump administration, up until when then sitting Attorney General Sessions rescinded the Cole memo and largely closed the door on us because it had massive implications on custody and really dampered down any kind of institutional participation. And we've been in basically a glacier ever since. So I'm really looking forward to a new cycle emerging here where capital can start to flow and capital can start to get recycled. We can free up trapped liquidity that's been stuck. And so I think this is really great. And we're just starting to see this. We're only at the surface of this new phase.
So just to follow that up quickly, I mean, the biggest question I think on everyone's mind, are the barbarians at the gate yet? Like, will institutions come in and invest? What are you hearing, both for operators themselves, long-term asset managers buying stock, but also for potentially your clients, pension funds, whatever they may be that can invest in private funds?
Yeah, well, as an operator, their first lever to pull is to immediately be filing tax refunds if they haven't, going back 3 years. That's an immediate source of capital, low cost of capital, can't get much cheaper than that. So they can do that first and start to proceed forward there, and also probably stop paying 280E. Some of them have already started doing that, but we expect that to pick up. We think opportunistic institutional capital will move first. The largest pools of capital will be on the sidelines until there is actual banking legality, because it is still federally illegal. Rescheduling does not change that. So we need to see additional clarity from Congress. This is why we're also obviously supporters of the Commerce Clause, contesting the illegality or the federal government's interference with intrastate legal industry. It should be recognized as federally legal business.
Yeah, there's obviously a lot going on. There's that suit. There's also safer banking. I don't know. I don't even know what to say. On again, off again, on again, off again. Attached to stablecoin, maybe paired with that, attached to the FAA. But I guess Sundie, to you, thinking about like that package, like it seems like, and you said you've been preparing certainly for rescheduling, but the rest of it also seems momentous and seems like there's been a drumbeat, I would say, over the past 6 weeks, almost towards this, since the State of the Union. There was a State of the Union, a lot happening in the White House. There's rescheduling. Safer is certainly on the priority list, according to Senator Schumer. Like, how do you talk about this, I guess, internally and externally, like in this game that's happening in DC? Like, is 2024 the year that we see this seismic shift in cannabis? And then what does like January 2025 look for you and for the company?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I do believe that SAFER has an opportunity. Will it change banking? Not necessarily for the industry. And I think that people think it's going to be a big trigger for access to banking. But what we have to really look at is the Bank Secrecy Act. And that won't change. And there's two reasons it won't change: because it's a cash intensive business, and because there is a lot of illicit actors out there trying to do business in plain sight and mix in with the licensed entities. And banks don't necessarily want to get in the middle of that activity, nor hire the resources to do it. So compliance is a very expensive thing for financial institutions. What Safe Harbor does, though, is we sit between the cannabis industry and the financial institution, which allows us to assist the banks in having access to the industry. What they really want isn't necessarily, the business and the accounts. They want the relationship for lending, and they want the deposits at this point in time, because liquidity is an issue. And when liquidity is an issue with the banking environment, then credit becomes more difficult. So I do think that we're going to see more access to debt facilities, but the knowledge it takes to actually bank the cannabis industry requires a lot of education, and bank secrecy is going to drive that. Now, SAFER does say that we're going to take a look at bank secrecy, but, and again, I'm really surprised that this moved through the DOJ faster than it moved through Congress and the Senate, in terms of SAFER. That really surprises me, because the DOJ is the one who has to do the job and find those illicit actors. Banking is going to help find those illicit actors and remove them from the environment. So access to banking is important for the industry and weeding out the bad actors. So I think that SAFER is and it has an opportunity to pass this year, especially. But we've been working on that for 10 years.
Right. It's like the turtle and the hare type of scenario, right? That's a great point. And well, Jeremy's Canadian too, but I'm also Canadian. Yeah. I'm not Canadian, but I live in Toronto. And just because things are legal and the banking is normalized doesn't mean that banking is normalized necessarily, or that every bank wants to get in and sort of bank the cannabis industry. Which brings me to Brian. Brian, you've seen this over a very long period of time. And lots of fits and starts within there from Colorado to other states. And like, what is it? What are you talking to clients about today that you weren't talking about them yesterday? Like, are you blowing up? And like, are people like, does this mean we can do X, Y, and Z? And the answer from a lawyer's perspective is probably like, hold tight for a second. But like, what do those conversations look like for you today?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say it's a little before and after. And to your kind of bigger question, Jay, it's like, I think this will be viewed as one of the major milestones in the path to legalization, right? We have California in 96 passing medical. We have Colorado and Washington legalizing in 2012. And I think people will look back, the history books, and say, well, 2024, that was the year that the federal government made this acknowledgement, and hopefully Florida and South Dakota also legalize, right? So it's all incremental. I've learned that in my several decades of working in this space. But yeah, I would say I've talked to, 50 clients that have blown up my phone in the last 24 hours, as well as the Wall Street Journal and all these other folks that are taking this issue seriously. And I think the biggest thing for operators is really the 280E fix, which can't be understated. I think Morgan did a great job laying that out. But imagine running a business with a 60, 70, 80% effective tax rate. I mean, it's absolutely insane. And if we're going to be able to fix that this year, which it seems quite likely, I mean, that's going to make these businesses that have really put their necks on the line forever to service patients and to follow state law while breaking federal law, it's going to give them a fair shot to compete, and that's big business and small business. So I think it's a giant deal. So a lot of our work is kind of starting to counsel people on 280E and how to embrace this.
We got some nods backstage too. We have some operators, CEOs backstage, and we're going to talk with them in a few minutes. And I guess I want to ask a question that I like to ask, because these are all the things you knew you were going to be talking about. But are there things that your sort of internal conversations are happening that may be less obvious? That you're saying, like, are there still question marks of what this might mean? Certainly 280E, certainly the lending environment, all the things that I think are the obvious things. What are the less obvious things? And we'll start with Brian. Like, what are the less obvious things that we are missing the ball on? And let me just shout out that Jeremy wrote an unbelievable newsletter today at cultivated.news that goes through a lot, both obvious and not so obvious. But I think what we often see, and certainly I'll just, like, on LinkedIn conversations, are like the obvious, like, this is amazing or this sucks. But like, where in the nuance are the questions about what this might mean for the industry that are yet to be decided? I mean, is it about timing when it go into effect? Is it about, some unintended consequences that you've read in the details or been thinking about, as Sundie said, for the past while? Brian, what are the unintended things, or the non-obvious things that we ought to be keeping our eye on?
Sure. Well, I mean, some of the questions we've gotten, a lot of it's like the timeline, right, which we discussed a little bit here. And I really encourage people to get active in the comment period. But, is there a criminal justice impact? I had clients call me that very sophisticated people say, well, it looks like it's legal now, and I think we need to clarify, really, there's no criminal justice direct impact here. I do think it'll be persuasive to legislators as they look at changing cannabis laws for the better. I mean, another just kind of wacky issue, but an issue that I found pretty interesting, is how this impacts charitable donations from cannabis businesses. I'm on the board of the Marijuana Policy Project, and we're always trying to, bring in donations to change cannabis laws. And this appears like the 280E piece will allow those to be deductible the way a traditional 501c3 or nonprofit contribution we made. So there's kind of exciting little pieces like that we're kind of fleshing out. But yeah, I don't know. I'm curious to hear what Morgan and Sundie have to say.
Sundie, you want to take that one next?
Sure. So one of the things that, Safe Harbor did right from the very beginning was set a lot of standards and going across state lines and interpreting the FinCEN guidelines. And as our clients grew, it grew us to taking funds from 41 states. And now our clients are actually looking international. So the thing I keep wondering is how this is going to impact the international scheduling and what that's going to do for the industry at this point in time. Does that mean that the U.S. is taking a leadership role here and we're going to see some change at the international level? Does that, open the gates for it, or does that remain a Schedule 1? So I'm kind of watching that because our clients are watching that at the same time. Yeah.
Morgan, you've had the longest time to think about telling us something we don't know, but what for you is sort of non-obvious about this?
We think there's a perception out there that upon rescheduling does automatically mean the exchanges are open. The U.S. exchanges, New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ. That is not a certainty yet. We've got some time. Hopefully we can get some things clarified that, or some additional work done in DC that could, make that a reality. But what was really interesting yesterday is everyone's been talking about, there's no way for these companies to trade. And, they had something like a 6x volume boost yesterday. So for exchanges that were not supposed to be that liquid, all of a sudden we're very liquid yesterday. So when there's demand, there were also a lot of people selling, right? There was a tremendous amount of turnover, and markets are down a bit today. The very short-term stuff, but we do need access to the exchanges to really open up to a larger audience of institutional capital. So I just, that's one thing that seems like from our side of Poseidon that we're like, this is not an automatic given, but we're also used to, in cannabis, nothing is an automatic given. There's always more work to be done, and we got to keep pushing forward, because the ultimate goal is, full federal legalization with a fully regulated market nationwide. And we're obviously not there yet, but this is still a very big first step.
Yeah.
Morgan, I just wanted to follow up on that question. You touched on this earlier. What about things like custodians, like the more plumbing of the financial system? Like, have you started to engage with them or heard how they're thinking about this, or is it all kind of going to be on a case by case basis?
Oh yeah, no, we were sending up feelers yesterday, testing the
I'm
waters,
sure.
but it's going to be they're looking for more clarity, and we really need it. Custody has got to be issue number one. And this is something that, comes all the way up to the SEC, and we need to have more clarity around it so that they're more comfortable with it. And so we're not treated in a lesser degree, that we're treated at parity or better than even like, the Bitcoin ETFs, right? I think it's kind of crazy that they get to trade on exchanges, but we're stuck with, all these crazy nuances, and custody is a big issue. So getting them comfortable. And that's why, again, I think if we could get some additional progress, if we got a Garland memo, Cole memo was a very useful document. I know it's concerning because it can be rescinded by the next administration and a change. But if it's something that can help while we're waiting for Congress to do something, or make progress more with like the Commerce Clause, other initiatives we just need as many shots on goal while we're trying to get this sorted out, is really helpful. But again, for the moment, I'm trying to celebrate, trying to be happy about, seeing this major progress, because it's been, over a decade investing in this space, and for once feeling like there's some acceptance at the federal government level feels very, very good. But yeah.
Morgan, Sundie, and Brian, thank you so much for joining us early and earlier. I guess that's what we're going to say, from Mountain Time Zone and a Pacific Time Zone. And Morgan, just to shout out that I'm going to take it as a hockey reference in the hockey playoffs on a cannabis morning program. So thank you for doing that, even though the Leafs beat the Bruins last night, which makes Jeremy happy and me upset.
Another day, yeah.
It's really unbelievable to make it happen. But I really appreciate your insight, your willingness and ability to be here this morning. Good luck as you unpack what both the certainty and uncertainty about what this means. We hope to have you back very shortly. But Sundie, Morgan, and Brian, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take you guys off stage and then put people on stage, because we got another group coming up now. Oh, there we go. There we go. We are lucky, Jeremy, this morning, and so are our viewers and listeners later in the day, to have David Goubert, the CEO of Air Wellness, and Brandon Pollock from the CEO of Theory Wellness. David and Brandon, thank you for being here.
Well, thanks for having us.
Well, yeah. It's been a busy it's not even 24 hours. Say 24 hours is like it happened yesterday morning, but it really happened mid to late afternoon. Yesterday, the announcement. I want to ask both of you, what do you think the first impact to your business will be once the decision becomes final, whenever that may be? But how are you planning for what the impact will be? And David, we'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. It's game changer. I mean, it's funny. Yesterday, I was actually in a quarterly board meeting with my board, and everybody at the same time during that board meeting was like, "Holy crap, it's happening! It's happening!" So it was a funny moment. I mean, it is a game changer for the company. If I go directly into numbers, but there's way more implication than that. But I mean, we've said before that at the current run rate, it's a $50 million a year impact for us if when 280 is eliminated. So it's a huge game changer for the company. Now, I think that there's way more implications than simply the financial implication that is linked to 280, and I'm sure we'll talk more about all that, but. In a simple word, yeah, it's the game changer.
That's so the board must have the meeting must have ended on a happy note with that sort of bottom line shift.
That's by far the best meeting we ever had. Yeah.
the most lucrative meeting you've ever had, for sure. Brandon, what was the thoughts around sort of Theory's office, but also sort of how you're thinking about it as it impacts the business right now?
Yeah, thanks, and good morning. Thanks for having me. I appreciate that you guys have two companies that started in Massachusetts representing the industry here.
Well,
so,
we both have deep roots in Massachusetts. I was born there, and Jeremy's from there, we'll say.
Ancestrally, yes.
Ancestrally.
Yeah. So yeah, as David mentioned, it's huge. I think it's certainly about time, right? This has kind of been the most obvious thing for any of us being in cannabis for any number of years. It's been sort of incredible to see the discrepancy between sort of reality and the federal scheduling. And, I think most of the impacts are going to be a little bit longer term, but certainly immediately it is a cash flow impact to any business from 280E sort of being, essentially removed. I mean, we're obviously looking at previous tax years as other folks are, but as a going forward basis, I think it immediately allows a lot more flexibility on investment with increased cash flow. And while there should be more capital coming in, it also reduces the need for capital and trying to finance with your own cash flow, which is, from my view, a much more safe way to grow these businesses.
Yeah, accountants thought their busy season was over, but it's actually just,
right.
It's actually just beginning.
Yeah. Yep.
David, I wanted to touch on something you said. I'm going to ask kind of the nerdy MBA question. For viewers that may not understand the specific mechanics of a balance sheet, like where does that extra $50 million run rate a year come from? And like, how important is free cash flow, all this free cash flow that's getting freed up, pun unintended, to your business and into servicing that?
Yeah. So basically, if I look at 23, I think we ended up the year at $462 million of revenue, have an awesome EBITDA that is at 25%. For the year 23. And despite that, because 280, meaning the tax, is the way it's calculated today, instead of being calculated on profit, it's calculated on gross margin, which is a huge disadvantage to any normal business. So because of that, that 50 million that I was referring to is actually getting us to a place where we're in a situation where before that, it's very hard to be free cash flow positive. That change is changing, I would say, the nature of the business for us, meaning because now with solid revenue, very solid EBITDA performance, we actually get to a place where it gets to the bottom line in a good place instead of really struggling on finishing flat or positive from a cash flow standpoint. So it's game changer. And to your point about the nerdy question, the difference is that you're taxed like a normal business based on profit instead of being taxed as your gross margin on what you produce. It's a huge difference for any company. But again, as I was saying, this is only one aspect, I think, of it. Like if you take back, and I'm pretty new to the industry still, I mean, a year and a half in the industry, but my understanding is that between the HHS and DEA, that's the very first time that we have the government and the federal actually having a positive momentum towards cannabis. That for more than 50 years, right? That's huge. So to me, that's a first change in terms of dynamic in our country, right? The second thing that it allows that is nuts to think about is that for the first time, it's actually recognized that scientifically recognized that the plant has true medical value. And not only that, but now it's going to be much easier for very different institutions and universities and colleges and so on to actually do some studies about the plant and continue to prove that point about the medical value of the plant. I mean, we just published with the Lecom College our own study on that, and there's more studies that we're working on right now. But that's going to change, I think, a lot about everything that we hear about this. So that's going to help, meaning propel faster the change of from a federal standpoint. Now, as we know, most of the U.S. people population is already very much in favor of it. I mean, 40 states medical, 25 states, I think, adult. and overall the population is very much for it. But now we're seeing that federal momentum that's actually changing that and allowing for true medical research on the plant, which I think is going to be, as we look midterm, long term, a very, very significant shift.
Brandon, I want to maybe jump off that point a bit, because I think that's talking from like a business operations perspective and a bit of sort of the nod, or at least not a head shake from the federal government. But does this, from your perspective, because I know you watch very closely what's happening in neighboring states to Massachusetts, and you're in some neighboring states to Massachusetts too, but do you think this has a momentum, a push for states that have been reluctant, like New Hampshire or other states, even in the South? To say, you know what, if the federal government is going from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, and imagine that we have some sort of banking reform, like, does this give more pause or push the momentum in favor of legalization in places like New Hampshire, or places even in Pennsylvania, or places in the South that say, like, we can't stand in the way of this anymore, because in New Hampshire's case, everybody's going to buy weed in Massachusetts, Maine, and Vermont. But like, what from your perspective, do you think this gives a push to other states, which will certainly have benefits to the industry, but also companies like yours that have entered new markets successfully?
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that's one of the most important. You can't be as precise on this sort of point as you can with 280E at all, but from a philosophical perspective, I think it's going to be massive for encouraging states that haven't either adopted a therapeutic program or an adult use program to sort of nudge some of these politicians in that direction. Now, we've seen as cannabis reform has started in the United States, it's primarily been driven by states that have more direct democracy, where you can do a ballot initiative, and then the will of the people can truly be heard. However, in states that have more legislative systems, like the Pennsylvanias and New Hampshires, you have a lot of politicians that are from a different, older generation than the folks that seemingly represent the majority of the views in society. And a lot of the reservations of reforming laws, I think, come from their sort of, more antiquated views. And a lot of that is based from growing up in an environment and living in an environment where the federal government is telling you for decades that this is highly dangerous and has no potential benefits for human health. So now that the federal government has made their move and said, listen, this is, we're admitting this is not that bad, I think that can provide a lot of political cover for some of these states that have been close to passing reform, but haven't gotten there because of some of the older folks in power just clinging on to these antiquated ideas. So I think that is, I think that's not to be understated, and that should really help quicken the pace that we see with other states coming online.
I think Jeremy's there you go.
Yeah. I have the joy of living in New York. There's a fire truck, and now there's a child screaming out the window, so I'm going on and off of mute. Brandon, I wanted to follow up on that point. Given that our neighbor to the north, my home country, has a federally regulated environment, right? How do you look at that as a business operator and say, like, we want what that have, coherent regulation from the top down? And how do you kind of make that argument, right, when you are thinking about states like New Hampshire that Jay brought up, where you might have, political obstacles to legalization that, some have merit and some don't?
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe Jeremy, you could clarify a little more. You're saying, like, from a state environment, how do you look at potential federal reform?
Yeah. How do you sort of make the argument that having top-down federal regulation can actually be beneficial, right, to states that are obstacles to reform?
Yeah, well, New Hampshire is a great example. So New Hampshire, we manage one of the 3 licenses there under a pretty small therapeutic program. And one of the goals that the state runs the liquor in the state through state-run stores. And the governor of New Hampshire is come out in favor of legalizing cannabis, but wants to do so in a way that has heavy state involvement. One of the main sources of pushback from elected officials in New Hampshire has been, well, due to the discrepancy between this hypothetical state law and the federal law, we're not comfortable sort of taking the risk there and putting the state on the line. So I think you have states like New Hampshire, or states generally that are just more conservative, don't want to put laws in place that would oppose the federal sort of direction and law of the land. Yeah. So yeah, certainly I think reducing that perceived risk is important for adding sort of, some cover for these political discussions.
I would also say it takes that, what's the right thing? Arrow out of their whatever.
Right.
It takes a little bit of their ammunition away. That was the easiest one. Say, well, it's federally illegal. We're going to, or, it's Schedule 1. There's no way we're going to legalize. And that has sort of been taken away. But I think to your point, and we've talked to the sort of New Hampshire Cannabis Association, I think it's called. And that was one of theirs. We can't have a system like alcohol because it's Schedule 1. So I wonder if this actually might push more towards the governor's perspective than the industry perspective in New Hampshire. That might be an interesting thing to watch, because it's I think they're in their legislative session now.
Yeah, the timing is, they're right at the end of this process. So it's really interesting timing there.
Yeah. And it's funny how we were thinking that, and we're still thinking that what's happening at states level. So Ohio just having the vote in last November. We know there's the vote that's happening in Florida in November. Pennsylvania is a place that we're talking a lot about as we're involved in PA, and we're thinking that all this is all the movement at the state level is actually supporting changes also at the federal level, right? But now we're getting the other way around as well, saying what's happening at the federal level may be supporting some changes at the state level. So it's an interesting dynamic both ways, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
David, one more question for you. I know that it's hard to understand the specific mechanics of the timing of these sort of complex interagency issues. But as an operator leading a company, how do you plan for this? Like, what do you tell your investors, your employees, your customers? How do you kind of plan for all this uncertainty, even though there's kind of like a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, so to speak?
Yeah. So first, I would say what we've done already is file and change the way we're operating from that standpoint. So we've already filed for 2020 to 2022, which for us is about a $50 million refund that we're claiming. And then since end of March, we're actually made that change of saying, hey, we're not paying 280E. So I would say from a financial standpoint, we already took those steps that now we're like, okay, that's become really real. We've also been very transparent with our teams internally in terms of saying, hey, it's not because we're having a great revenue and great EBITDA that actually it means that we have flush in cash. It's not the case because of 280 and other things. So I think there's I got emails. I emailed the whole. We have about 2,400 employees. I emailed everybody yesterday and had people answering back, meaning employees in everywhere, answering to me back saying, this is amazing. We were waiting for it. So I think even everyone working in the industry, and I can speak only for our employees, we're excited yesterday about the news. So I think this is something that a lot of people understand the importance of it. From an investor standpoint, we saw an influx yesterday, like everybody else, about request of, hey, we want in, kind of, which we'll need to figure out when is the right time to actually do that and what's the right stock level, I would say, to start doing things like that. But from a at least short, medium term standpoint in terms of strategy, it doesn't change much in terms of focus, meaning that our focus has been for a year and a half on cash flow generation and making sure that we're running a really well-oiled machine that's performing well. We're not going to change that overnight. The focus for 24 remains the same focus with that, plus preparing the foundation for what we have ahead of us. And as a company, we have a lot of tailwinds with Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and so on. So I'd say short, midterm, next 6 to 12 months, doesn't really change our strategy because we're already kind of anticipated that, and it doesn't change that we need to be very focused on that cash flow generation short term. It will likely change what happens after that in terms of how we're looking at acquisitions or other things from an M&A standpoint. Doesn't mean we're going to do anything right now, but what we're doing is going to be very, I'd say, opportunistic right now on, hey, we love the states we're in, we love our footprint. Now, if there's something that comes up that makes a lot of sense, we'll go for it. But it doesn't change fundamentally the strategy for the next year, if you want. After that is a different story, but we also need other things to happen to be able to really transform from a future standpoint. So that's how we're approaching it internally and externally.
Yeah. Brandon, I want to ask you, I'm thinking about this. We just talked about sort of the impact on states and the state's impact on the feds. But it seems to me that that theory, at least when I've been to the shops, like super focused on the customer experience and the patient experience as well. And maybe even from an employee perspective, what you're hearing today, but like, does this in some way open up more patients and customers to the industry? And I don't know if a DEA decision from Schedule 1 to Schedule E, consumers or patients even know, but do you think there's an impact even to like normalizing cannabis on a day-to-day basis that this has, when I would say sort of all the things the president talks about at the State of the Union, the vice president has a roundtable at the White House, rescheduling from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, maybe some banking normalization, like, we know, David said earlier, like the population is in favor of this, but do you think all of those things and the drumbeat lend itself to a bigger aggregate industry? And sort of how are you, your patients, your customers, your employees thinking about that? And do you expect there to be an impact for that?
Yeah. I think it's similar to what we were talking about with some of the elected officials. There's a lot of folks, typically, I would surmise that it's an older demographic that do, whether we agree with it or not, believe a lot of what the government says surrounding this issue. And that creates a lot of inherent trepidation with using cannabis as an alternative to either, medications, simply as a wellness product, or an alternative to alcohol. So getting this out, it's in front page of New York Times. It's going to be in the press a lot. It's going to be a major talking point, I think, on the re-election campaign for the president. So I do see this as meaningful and certainly positive from encouraging more folks to think maybe differently about cannabis. Because, if it does have 70% support, 30% is still a lot of people. And employees as well. It's certainly exciting from our team. I'm also excited to see what it does from a recruitment perspective. There's a lot of folks who would love to enter the industry, who have incredible resumes, energy, experience. And there's trepidation inherently of, well, am I going to lose my mortgage? Am I going to have, some personal issues by jumping on board with, either our team or someone else's? So I think that's going to be interesting too, to see what sort of extra talent we can bring in.
Yeah. What you're saying here is so true. Like employees an employee last week was telling me that one of their bank just sent them a check and saying, hey, you're out, period. And then just scrambling to figure out what to do. That said, I think a lot of people are getting very, very interested in industry. Again, I'm new in the industry, but we were able to hire a lot of amazing talent that probably would not have looked at it 3 years ago and now do. But I think that's going to amplify that. I do think it's going to normalize a bit the industry for future customers. What I was saying earlier about medical studies and so on, and the ability to actually make that public, right, is going to change also a lot of the sentiment towards the plant. And then let's face it, until now, it's much easier for the big boys to be able to stay in business. And I think that this is also changing that dynamic, which allows smaller companies and local companies to actually stay afloat because of that. So I think it's going to change the landscape and the dynamic. Yeah.
I think actually what you said, David, when you talked about sort of the positive hit to your bottom line, I think if you take 1/1000th of that and you create a very small business, it is just as impactful.
Or even more. Agreed.
Even more, right? Because it's So I really want to thank you, Brandon, and thank you, David, for joining us here this morning on very short notice. We love to keep these about 45 minutes in total to get people back to actually generating the revenue that you used to be paying in taxes, but now you'll be generating for your bottom line. I really appreciate it. Hope to have you back again soon, Brandon and David.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you,
Thanks so
guys.
much.
Okay, bye, y'all. Jeremy, that was great. I
That was
really
awesome.
like that.
Yeah, I did too. And I think I learned a lot. And I think, some of these issues seem like they are unsettled, but very interesting. And like, it's cool to see how operators are thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
Because I can write about it all day, but to see how people are actually practically making decisions with all the uncertainty is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, and it was great from a legal perspective, financial perspective, operating perspective. It was a great conversation, and so obviously this will be up on YouTube. Let's see, I think our YouTube is at Cultivated Media. You'll be able to find it if you search Cultivated Media on YouTube. It's also on our LinkedIn channel. Jeremy, thank you as well, because it's been a very busy less than 24 hours. If you haven't read Jeremy's write-up today in our newsletter at cultivated.news, I encourage you to go read that. You can find our daily newsletter there. You can follow us on LinkedIn. You can smash the subscribe button on YouTube. And Jeremy, I'm going to be back here tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern with Krista Raymer, talking maybe about the impact to retail on this, but also what she's seeing on the retail level of cannabis throughout the U.S. and North America, actually. And then on Friday, Jeremy, I will be live on the floor of NECANN in Baltimore.
Yep.
Which will be the first trade show that happened after this rescheduling announcement. Will be quite close to DC. So maybe we'll get some DC perspective from that show as well. Thanks, Jeremy.
I'll be watching, Jay. I can't wait.
Yeah, and this would be a great week, so Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, to buy cannabis at your local dispensary, to talk about, celebrate, and think about the DEA's rescheduling decision, which we hopefully finalize. We'll have a better timeline after this week. Jeremy, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Jay. Appreciate it.